I recently watched a video by a prominent vegan influencer on YouTube who was complaining about the profits and influence of big energy companies while praising what he believes to be the settled science and enlightenment of governments aiming at banning fossil fuels in order to, quote, combat climate change, end quote. His message appeared to be fossil fuel business bad, government good. Ironically, he sat there in a room lit and warmed by fossil fuels, making a video with electricity produced largely by fossil fuels, and communicating with the world via electrical equipment primarily powered by fossil fuels, while denouncing fossil fuels and the fossil fuel industry's profits. He lives in the UK. According to the Digest of UK Energy Statistics, 78% of energy consumed in the UK comes from fossil fuels, primarily oil and gas. In the UK, 41% of electricity is generated from fossil fuels, primarily gas. The UK does get about 25% of its electricity from wind, but this is possible only because the UK is a windy place. The wind does not blow as reliably everywhere. Similarly, about 79% of energy consumed in the US comes from fossil fuels, according to the US Energy Information Administration. Non-fossil fuels supply only 21% of total energy usage. Put otherwise, we would need to increase renewable energy production by a factor of 5 in order to produce enough renewable energy to meet our current energy consumption. In the US, 60% of electricity is generated from fossil fuels, 21% from renewables, and 19% from nuclear. Almost 25% of the world's total energy use goes towards heating and cooling of buildings. People die from lack of adequate heating or cooling. People who live in rural areas have a greater risk of death from hypothermia than people in urban areas. They use fossil fuels to heat their homes and to produce food and transport it to urban vegans. I live in a region where temperatures go below freezing for several months of the year. I'm extremely grateful that I have natural gas heating that keeps me warm when the temperatures are below zero. Fossil fuels literally save millions of lives every year. This influencer complained about the big profits of the energy companies. He argued that, due to their immense wealth, they buy fake, untrustworthy climate science, whereas allegedly non-profit government provides us with trustworthy climate science. The big 5 oil and gas companies combined realized a $200 billion profit in 2022. This article suggests that this is unfair given that people were suffering from hardship due to inflation, natural disasters, and war. Energy companies are run by and employ many people. Those companies and people also suffered from hardship due to inflation, natural disasters, and war. In fact, inflation is one of the main reasons the profits of these corporations appear to be at such large numbers and increasing annually. The US dollar has lost 95% of its purchasing power since 1900. When I first started driving in 1977, the average retail price of gasoline was only 62 cents per gallon. In today's dollars, that is $3.27. In fact, that is about the going rate for gasoline where I live in March 2024. Dishonest people will blame the rise in price on the evil energy corporations. In fact, that 5 times increase in price is largely due to devaluation of the dollar. That isn't the fault of the energy companies. Government did that. In 1977 dollars, the median household money income in the US was $13,570. In 2022, it was $74,500. Thus, the median dollar income also increased by about 5 times. If you're dishonest, you could say that US households are making record profits 5 times what they made in 1977. In fact, much of the apparent increase in money income is simply due to the devaluation of the dollar, which is a consequence of government and Federal Reserve policies that increase the supply of dollars. By the way, the original US colonies were corporations of the Crown, business entities, and the founders of the US government modeled the US Constitution on corporate charters. The US is literally a public chartered corporation. Anyway, I wanted to ask this influencer, if energy corporations are suspicious because of their monetary profits, what about these governments that you put your faith in? How much money do they take in, and how do they take it in? In 2023, the US federal revenue was $4.4 trillion, 22 times the profits of the 5 largest Western oil and gas companies in 2022. In the same year, US federal spending was more than $6 trillion, 30 times the profits of the 5 largest Western oil and gas companies in 2022. Well, if money buys science and propaganda, who can buy more? Those 5 oil and gas companies or the US government? Now let us ask, how does the US government, or any government for that matter, acquire revenue? Taxation, which is nothing more than theft and slavery. The government declares that a portion of the wealth that you produce belongs to the government. This means that the government has declared that it owns a portion of your life. In other words, you are its slave. In case you refuse to comply with this confiscation, the government has hired thugs who will put a gun to your head to force compliance. If this fails, the thugs will kidnap you and put you in a cage. Contrast this with the way that those evil energy companies earn revenue. First, they find, refine, and supply products. Then they put them on the open market and customers purchase those products voluntarily. No energy company forces you to use their products. If you decide to ride a bicycle or go off-grid, no thug shows up with a gun to force you to buy fossil fuels. The same is true of any private enterprise. You are free to refuse to use the product or service unless the government has declared that you must use X product. The US government spends more dollars than it acquires by theft and slavery. They call this deficit spending. The government finances this deficit spending by borrowing dollars from the Federal Reserve. Where does the Federal Reserve get the dollars? Simply, they print more dollars, either paper notes or digits on a ledger. Let that sink in. Neither the government nor the bank actually creates wealth. They simply increase the supply of currency called Federal Reserve notes. The government then spends this freshly minted so-called money. The US national debt and the supply of US dollars have increased dramatically since the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, which established the Federal Reserve System, the central bank. Economic law dictates that as the supply of dollars increases, the value of each dollar must decrease proportionately. If you compare the chart of the increase in the US national debt to the chart of the decrease in the purchasing power of the US dollar, you can see that these are inversely related. The more the US government borrows, the more the Federal Reserve increases the dollar supply, and the more the supply of dollars goes up, the more the purchasing power of each dollar decreases. As the purchasing power of the dollar decreases, everyone needs to raise their price for services or products in order to maintain their standard of living. In short, the government is the cause of the inflation that is causing people hardships. You can't blame this on the energy companies. They have to use the same banker-made dollars as you do. They also suffer hardships, increased cost of doing business due to inflation. Inflation is a method of hidden taxation, occult theft. By deficit spending, government can confiscate and transfer more wealth from the people to the bankers and so-called elites without obviously raising taxation rates. Like many people, this particular influencer claimed that the energy industry peddles falsehoods about the role of carbon dioxide in climate, while the government allegedly tells everyone the truth. Yeah, right. Private enterprises are in the business of providing products and services. They succeed or fail depending on whether people voluntarily purchase their products and services, unless they collude with government to force people to use their products or services. They produce advertisements and marketing materials, but no one is required to pay any attention to or accept this propaganda as truth unless government enforces it. In contrast, the business of government is to control people's behavior, confiscate wealth, and monopolize the use of force for those purposes. The word government tells you what it's about. Mind control, i.e., tricking you into accepting slavery. Governments use threats of violence, 12 years of compulsory public education, relentless propaganda, police and armies to control people's minds and behavior. One must be quite naive, misinformed, programmed, or stupid to think that any agent of government is trustworthy. Government agents frequently use deception to control the people, and especially to gain popular support for increased government control and various acts of aggression. This is a historical fact. You can't seriously believe that advertisements put out by evil big businesses have as much control over what people think, believe, and do as the 12 years of compulsory government education to which they are subjected starting before the age of maturity, before they can think critically about what they are being taught by the masters. Ironically, the proof that government has more control over what this influencer thinks than any scary big business is that he completely believes that what the government tells him about the climate and scary carbon dioxide is true without question. The government wants him to believe that big business is the bad actor and government is the savior, and he believes that. Who owns science? Private enterprise employs about 42% of scientists, while government institutions employ 43%. Government schools have convinced many people, including this particular influencer, that government scientists are more trustworthy than industry scientists. Is that really true? No. Yes, it is true that industry scientists typically have biases in favor of their industry. Yes, industries have committed crimes, especially when colluding with government. Yes, you should use critical thinking when evaluating claims made by industry scientists. However, the idea that government-funded scientists have pure motives is pure baloney. Scientists who depend on government grants or salaries for income, at a minimum, have a need to please the people who fund them, namely government agents. For the most part, private enterprises employ scientists to do research that will enable them to develop or improve the products or services that they offer. The government is in the business of control and confiscation of wealth, including the defense of its territory and the waging of wars. The people who rule want scientists to do research that will help them rule. Since they hold the purse strings for a basically unlimited spending budget, these agents can control the outcomes of scientific research by simply deciding who does and who does not get funds for doing research. By controlling the funding of research, the government controls the scientific consensus. Simply, those who do the research that the government wants get funded, and those who do not agree with the government do not get funded. When those on government payroll control what gets published and what does not get published, you get an otherwise statistically impossible high level of consensus. Science has a large-scale problem with fraud. In 2023, more than 10,000 research papers were retracted, and experts believe this is only the tip of an iceberg. This article reports on 25,710 cases of academic misconduct retraction between 2000 and 2023. A big chunk of this fraud is committed by tenured faculty of publicly funded institutions. Knowledge will always govern ignorance. That means that those who know the truth will govern those who don't. If you can convince someone that something is true when it is not, you can take advantage of their ignorance. This is the game of the con man. Governments have a policy of pretending to have knowledge or quote-unquote intelligence that is unavailable to the common people, and using this quote-unquote science to generate fear so that people will beg for more government control and intervention or support waging of war. In 2002, U.S. government agents claimed to have intelligence that Iraq was killing babies and had weapons of mass destruction. They lied, and an estimated 250,000 innocent people died. In March 2020, UK government scientist Neil Ferguson predicted that a certain virus would kill 490,000 people in the UK and 2.2 million people in the USA within a year if the governments did not enforce lockdowns. If you can't see how this was, like the claims about Iraq, fear-mongering and served the interest of government agents, I truly feel sorry for you. His predictions were wildly incorrect. It did not matter. All that government agents wanted was intelligence to scare people into accepting more government control. I'm old enough to remember when the NASA scientists were claiming that they had science indicating that we were on the verge of a new ice age. Everyone was going up in blue smoke by 1989. Rivers and streams were going to boil dry. Fine dust was going to block out sunlight, causing temperatures to drop. Space satellites confirmed that the new ice age was coming fast. Telltale signs were everywhere in 1974. It was scary. It didn't happen. Governments, including the United Nations, and bankers, central banks and IMF, want so-called climate science to prove that carbon dioxide is a pollutant so that they can justify more wealth confiscation in the form of carbon taxes. Make no mistake, the IMF of the UN knows that the common people will pay these taxes in the form of artificially higher prices for electricity, gasoline, heating oil, and so on. To be clear, Governments and their banker backers, not big energy corporations, want to artificially make energy more expensive for the common person. In other words, governments admit that they have a plan to impose hardship and increase cost of living on everyone, including you. Carbon taxes would provide the US government with hundreds of billions of dollars in new government revenue each year. There exists no specific plan for how government agents would spend this revenue. They will dole it out as they please. Insider trading, anyone? Carbon taxes are just a new way to transfer huge amounts of wealth from the common people to the bankers and so-called elites. Please understand this. Since taxation transfers wealth from the common people to the gangsters and bankers, it is the primary reason for poverty. Unfortunately, people who were subjected to compulsory public education commonly erroneously believe that the government taxation is the solution to poverty and wealth disparity, as well as most other social problems. How many wars have been waged by private corporations? None I am aware of. War is the business of government. The US government has waged at least 107 wars since its inception, resulting in the deaths of more than 1 million soldiers, not to mention civilian casualties. But that's not all. Since World War II, the US military has killed more than 20 million people in 37 different nations. No private enterprise has murdered this many people by any means. How anyone, particularly any vegan, can regard the government as anything other than a criminal enterprise and public enemy is beyond me. No government occupies moral high ground from which to bully the rest of us to reduce our carbon footprint or environmental impact. The US military is one of the largest climate polluters in history. It consumes more liquid fuels and has more emissions than most countries. If it were a nation state, it would be the 47th largest emitter in the world. Illustrating the fact that government depends on deception, the governments forming the United Nations exempted their military pollution from consideration in climate accords. Fancy that. All the gangsters agreed to exempt themselves from the restrictions they have decided to impose on everyone else. Fuel for me, not for thee. We'll go about destroying everything with bombs and blame the wreckage on the people who want to avoid freezing to death in the winter. The advocates of carbon taxes claim that putting a price on carbon, quote, makes those responsible for the damages caused by greenhouse gas emissions pay for those damages, end of quote. That's rich. They are going to tax you and I for using fossil fuels for electricity, heating and air conditioning, production of food, goods and services, and transportation, because allegedly we are responsible for the alleged damages caused by wrong use of fossil fuels. Meanwhile, they use the wealth they steal from us to waste fossil fuels to bomb and destroy things and kill millions of people. And we are the guilty parties? Who's going to tax the military for its carbon emissions? Carbon dioxide is literally the foundation of life on Earth. Since plants need it to produce glucose and oxygen by photosynthesis, you wouldn't have anything to breathe or eat without it. We also use plants for fiber to make clothing and shelter, and increasingly renewable biomass fuels for electricity and heating. Even NASA admits that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide explain 70% of the observed increase in vegetation growth on Earth since the 1970s. For a moment, let's set aside preoccupation with the alleged dangers of this gas that you emit with every exhalation and constitutes only about 0.04% of Earth's atmosphere. Let's talk about some really toxic chemicals. At least 245 of 700 US military bases have been polluting drinking water with toxic PFAS forever chemicals. In 2017, the Environmental Working Group estimated it would take decades to clean up just the filthiest 50 of those sites. 5 years later, in 2021, they reported that cleanup plans were only under development for only 9 of those worst bases, and also identified a total of 703 military sites with known or suspected discharges of PFAS. They've dragged their feet despite knowing of the toxicity of these chemicals since the 1970s. In 2019, the US military dumped 630,000 pounds of nitrate compounds into the ocean off Oahu. Between 1944 and 1978, it dumped tens of thousands of bombs into the ocean off of Oahu. In 1955, it dumped 4,220 tons of unspecified toxics and hydrogen cyanide and about 1.6 million pounds of mustard bombs 5 miles off Pearl Harbor. In 1945, it dumped 20,000 pounds of hydrogen cyanide bombs, 1.1 million pounds of cyanogen chloride bombs, and more off the coast of Waianae. Between 1964 and 1978, it dumped 2,189 steel drums of radioactive waste off Oahu and discharged 4.8 million gallons of low-level radioactive waste liquid into Pearl Harbor. Between 1960 and 1994, it contaminated Hawaii with depleted uranium. In the 1960s, it sprayed ships and crews stationed in Hawaii with pathogenic bacteria and chemical agents, including the nerve agent sarin gas, for quote-unquote testing. Finally, the military has 20 huge 20-story high jet fuel tanks holding 250 million gallons of jet fuel in Red Hill above Pearl Harbor. These tanks sit only 100 feet above the drinking water aquifer of Honolulu. It's only a matter of time before they leak jet fuel into that drinking water. When you take into account all military pollution, the US military is the world's biggest polluter. In the US alone, the military has contaminated 39,000 areas spread across 19 million acres. So far, about 900 of the nearly 1,200 Superfund sites in the US are abandoned military facilities or sites that otherwise support the military. These facts should amply illustrate that the government is not trustworthy. It is the sole source of the inflation and wars, and likely the main source of the toxic pollution that creates hardships for many people. Sorry to say, people who fall at the feet of government are fools. They drank the pro-government Kool-Aid force-fed in public schools and never questioned it. Government is violence. So I don't see how any vegan dedicated to nonviolence can regard any government or the collection of governments called the United Nations as anything other than an enemy of the people, animals, and earth. I'm not saying that one should go the opposite way and believe everything privately funded scientists claim. There's been plenty of deception from them as well, especially when the ostensibly private enterprise has a very cozy relationship with the government, where the government is involved in coercing or forcing people to use specific products. Government is by its very nature coercive and deceptive, and governments are demonstrably the most evil actors in our world. Because of government's pretense to have authority to monopolize the use of force, government is far more dangerous than any private enterprise. Therefore, in my opinion, whether you are about to buy a product or service, or are buying into a narrative, whether peddled by private enterprise or especially by governments, the same warning applies. Caveat emptor.